Chilling tales for dark nights.
Chilling tales for dark nights. Last of the Sparks. My name is Aaron Sparks. Back in February 2008, I decided I needed to change my monotonous life. Whether that change would come in the form of a new job or a new toothbrush, I didn't know. I was never the most adventurous person. I've always found it difficult to veer away from my comfort zone, and the limit of my existence usually depended upon which book I was reading at the time. It took me a while to realize that most of the happiness in my life was derived from works of fiction, from stories I often found myself lost in for days at a time. I was an avid bookworm, as miserable an expression as that is. Once I realized my true outlet, I immediately knew what I wanted. I purchased a small shop, quit my boring job, renovated the building, and transformed it into a bookstore. I'd never been happier. The next 2 years were the best of my life. The store had become a huge hit with the locals. My perspective on work had been completely altered, and I was feeling genuinely happy for the first time since my childhood. It was during the winter of 2010 that she walked into my store. She stepped inside out of the snow and approached me with a large bin bag. Etchings of age covered her pale face and hands. She must have been at least 80 years old. Slamming the bag on the counter, she simply said, "These are for you." I looked inside the bag to find a selection of some of the greatest novels ever written. "Why?" I asked, confused. "Do you want money for these, or some kind of book trade?" "No, they're yours to have," she said. "Take them." A feeling of unease swept over me as I stood in the woman's presence. Her dirty gray fringe slightly concealed her face as a cold gaze met my vision. "Are you sure you want me to have them?" I asked. "Wouldn't you rather sell them?" "No, I have no use for them, or for money." "Okay, thank you. What's your name?" "Lucy." She departed from my store shortly after muttering her final words. I found it all too strange that somebody would give away such great books for nothing, but I suppose some people are just nice. I made my way home that night and took the books with me so that I could go through them. I piled them all up on the table and was surprised to see that all of them were in fantastic condition. A couple of them seemed to be first editions, and others were versions I had never even seen before. It took me a moment to realize it, but the novels that I was looking at were not as I had remembered them to be. The first book that I picked up was The Green Mile. On the cover there was an image of John Coffey, smiling and holding 2 dead naked girls. I opened it up and flipped through the pages. In this version of the novel, he was in fact guilty of the rape and murder of both children. I made my way to the end of the book and read through the execution scene. All of the officers who had originally grown to love John Coffey in the original novel were now laughing uncontrollably and screaming racial taunts as he was being executed. My eyes had seen enough, and my stomach had felt enough, too. The next book I picked up was The Catcher in the Rye. The artwork upon the front page seemed to be of a dead body splattered on the street, as seen from an aerial perspective. I flipped through the book until I reached chapter 14. After Holden Caulfield speaks of messing with the idea of suicide, he suddenly breaks down in tears and jumps from the window, cracking his skull on the pavement below. The book abruptly ended after that. I then picked up Lord of the Flies. The defining image of this novel was of a large child with the face of a pig. He was covered in blood and surrounded by decaying corpses. After thumbing through a few pages, I reached a point of the story in which Piggy is described as being non-human, vicious, and a hungry animal. A chapter or so later, Jack insulted Piggy, which led him to lose his temper and rip Jack apart. Piggy then proceeded to kill and eat the rest of the children. The remainder of the book was the same line repeated over and over. Piggy sat alone on the island waiting for death. I read through the few books that were left in the pile, and they had all been changed in some sick way. The Great Gatsby, Wuthering Heights, To Kill a Mockingbird, Ulysses, every one of them. Just as I reached the bottom of the pile, I noticed that the final book was one that I've never even heard of before. It was called Last of the Sparks. Considering the contents of the other books thus far, I found the inclusion of my last name in the title unnerving. Still, it was just a book. The cover was of 6 gravestones, with words too small to be read, etched into the granite. I looked at the top corner of the book and noticed there was a sell-by date on it. June 4th, 2013. I nervously opened it up to the beginning of the story. Chapter 1. Alice Sparks. My stomach dropped as I read my mother's name upon the page. I felt dizzy and confused as I anxiously made my way through the chapter. It seemed to detail a regular day in the life of the character. That is until I reached the last page. Alice was crossing the road when the heel of her shoe broke, causing her to fall. She didn't get to her feet fast enough and a speeding car struck her, puncturing both of her lungs. I felt sick to my stomach. I put the book down and went straight to bed, hoping for some sleep. As it turned out, that was wishful thinking. I lay awake for most of the night as innumerable questions ran through my mind. By daybreak, I had managed to get a couple hours of sleep, but only after I spent an hour convincing myself that there was nothing to worry about. It's just a book, I told myself. It's just a book. The next morning when I got to work, I was feeling worse for wear. It wasn't until lunchtime that I began to perk up and regain a bit of energy. Then the phone rang. I answered the call, and I heard my father sobbing on the other end. I immediately knew what had happened. I closed the shop and ran to the hospital, but it was already too late. She was gone. The victim of a hit-and-run driver going 60 in a 35, they said. I spent the next couple of weeks helping take care of my dad. Me, my brother, and my sister stayed with him in turns and looked after him. We all looked after each other. It wasn't until a few months later I picked up Last of the Sparks again. It had scared me so much the last time that I considered tossing it in the trash. But I never did. Rather, I felt strangely compelled to hang on to it. I opened the book up to page 37. And there it was. Chapter 2. Patrick Sparks. The story was more of the same. A day in the life of a man that bore my father's name. It documented an ordinary day. Ordinary, that is, until the part where he shot himself in the kitchen whilst on the phone with his son. Suddenly, I was possessed by an urge to run to the phone and call my father, to speak with him, comfort him. But then I realized what I may be doing. Before I had the chance to hang up, someone picked up on the other end. then he was gone. I got my black suit and tie out once more and repeated the same process for another parent. It ruined us all. After the funeral, I refused to touch the book. What if I caused these deaths by reading it? I couldn't go through it all again. But on Christmas Eve of 2011, I got a phone call from my brother's wife, Heather. Will had been putting up Christmas lights on the roof when he slipped on a patch of ice-coated shingles and broke his neck. He died almost instantly, the coroner said. I lost it. I threw the phone at the wall and began to sob into my sleeve. Anger took the pain away for a moment, long enough for me to pick up the book and read through chapter 3. It was exactly as Heather had described. I fell asleep and woke up the next day with the book still on my lap. I decided to read ahead and discover who would be the next to go, whether it be me or one of my sisters. Whoever was next, I was determined to warn them, or give myself advance notice, as the case may be. I turned the page. Chapter 4, Mary and Sarah Sparks. I rushed through the story as fast as I could until I reached the end. Both my sisters and their partners would drown in a lake after colliding with another car on a one-way bridge. That same sickly feeling overtook me. I met with my sisters later that day to exchange gifts, and I told them as calmly as I could that they ought to be careful while driving. I tried to sound as sincere as possible as I mentioned the lake, the bridge, and even the fact that all four of them would be in the car at the same time. Of course, they didn't take me seriously, chalking up my apprehension up to fears of losing more loved ones. But at least I told them. Mary and Sarah drowned 8 months later in August 2012. Following the funeral, I picked up the book and turned to the final pages. Chapter 5, Aaron Sparks. But I didn't read it. I decided I'd rather not live in fear for who knows how long. So I decided to save it for a later time. After all, there was a sell-by date on it for a reason. Everything has been normal for the past 5 months or so. I've lost interest in reading, though, so I'm back to my old miserable self. I questioned myself every day as to why the old woman was doing this to me. But it doesn't matter. It's all gonna be over soon anyway. I've just finished reading the final chapter. It's June 4th, 2013, and I'm sitting in my basement, waiting for her to arrive. That's the way the ending goes. Or so I've read.
My Last Night Babysitting by Jeanna Saccomano. Narrated by Kellie Fitzgerald. After much wavering and second-guessing, I finally bit the bullet and returned to graduate school last fall. I'm sure several of you know how difficult it is to juggle a rigorous PhD program and a full-time job. I was going to need a small source of income, but wanted something that would allow school to be my first priority. As luck would have it, a good friend of mine knew a family in desperate need of a quality babysitter. Their current sitter had recently graduated high school and was heading out of state for college. Initially, I felt a little odd accepting work as a babysitter. After all, I was in my mid-20s, a PhD student, and engaged to be married. But hell, the hours were flexible, the money was fantastic, and I could anticipate a great deal of solid study hours after the toddler was sleeping soundly. To be quite honest, it was smooth sailing from the start. The family was overwhelmingly generous with their money, and their 3-year-old daughter, Allison, was quite well behaved, even in all her mischievous toddler glory. Over the next few months, I found myself up there several times a week, mostly relieving the mother, Renee, in the afternoon so she could run errands and catch a coffee break. I occasionally sat on Saturdays so the parents could enjoy a date night to the movies. I wasn't especially fond of the weekend night shifts, especially because the family lived in a large home, high up in the mountains, surrounded by acres and acres of trees. During the day, their heavily wooded property was serene and majestic, but once darkness fell, it was eerie in its silence. I tried not to pay attention to the rustling of small forest animals brushing past bushes, or to the sharp snapping of tree branches as the wind went about its nightly weaving. Mostly, I just tinkered around on my laptop or buried my nose in a textbook until I was relieved to go home. Everything changed this past February. It was an especially cold Saturday evening, and I was due to babysit around 7 that night. Renee's husband, Eric, was out of town on business, and she was excited to share a night out with the girlfriends. Armed with a backpack of heavy reading, I had my fiancé, Mark, drop me off on his way to the gym. The night was mellow, heated up some frozen pizza, drew a bath with an embarrassing amount of bubbles and Elmo toys, and had the kids in bed by 8. I had an exam the following Tuesday, and admittedly had a lot of studying to conquer. My fiancé arrived around 9:50, about 10 minutes before I was expecting Renee back home. Right at 10, and I mean on the nose. We heard footsteps on the wraparound deck and noticed Renee making her way to the front door. I remember finding it funny that I had been concentrating so hard that I hadn't even heard her Suburban drive up. Mark and I exchanged a knowing glance as Renee made her way into the living room where we sat. It appeared she might have had one glass of wine too many that evening, because she had this intoxicated, frozen grin on her face. At first I chalked it up to the booze, but when the grin remained, I started to feel uncomfortable. The way an unknown stranger staring from across a restaurant can make you feel. Renee was usually very chatty, perhaps even a bit ditzy, but tonight her answers were short, albeit still polite enough. I began to gather my things as my fiancé continued a game of solitaire on his phone. Renee sat at the oak dining table, that bizarre and unsettling grin still plastered to her face, and wrote out a check for me. There was something painfully uncanny about her movements. They were rigid, forced, almost animatronic. By the time we got down to the driveway, my fiancé and I both had baffled looks on our faces. Renee stood in the window, smiling down on us, waving her hand back and forth. I gave a short nod and wave, keeping my eyes on the gravel. That discomfort wasn't letting go. We walked past Renee's silver Suburban, taking note of how absolutely dusty it was, especially strange for someone that seemed to take her car in for a wash at least once a week. I traced my finger across the passenger door absent-mindedly, leaving a light coat of soot on the pad of my index finger. The car was filthy, like it had been through the elements. Where the hell did she go tonight? Through a sandstorm? I joked. Seriously, Mark trailed off. I'm not the only person who found the whole thing weird, right? I asked, attempting to keep my voice to a whisper. Ah, relax. She was probably just tipsy. Her smile, though, he said, closing the driver's door. We began our trek down the winding roads towards, after a long night of babysitting out in the boonies, what I always like to call sweet, sweet civilization. The drive from their house to the freeway was dark, lined with redwoods and deer, which I usually quite enjoyed. Tonight, it seemed endless. I had this overwhelming new desire to be on that highway, surrounded by other cars, amongst other drivers and passengers, heading into the city. We drove for what seemed like too long. Something wasn't right. I reached for my phone and glanced at the time. We were usually passing the first gas station by now. I pawed at the handle of my purse for the first time, noticing the bag's weight. I had totally forgotten my textbook. Reluctant to turn around when we had already been driving for so long, I made amends with the fact that I absolutely needed that text if I had any chance at rocking my exam. Mark let out a groan as he swung the wheel, turning back the way we came. Climbing the hill to Renee's house, I saw that the Suburban was no longer in the driveway. Now, she must have moved it into the garage for the night already. As we made our way to the deck, I saw the burgundy spine of my text on the couch through the sliding glass door. I continued on to the front door and knocked 3 times. No answer. I knocked again and then tried the door handle. Unlocked, as I usually left it while Renee and her husband were out. We made our way into the house, making sure to keep our footsteps quiet. "Sorry, it's just me. I forgot my book," I said, trying to keep my voice down. My fiancé was a few steps behind me, peering around the corner. "Her bedroom door is open, but the lights are off," Mark said, a confused look spreading across his face. "Renee?" I asked, a little louder this time. "Renee, it's me. You still awake?" Silence. We walked towards the kitchen, and I noticed the answering machine was blinking. I hadn't noticed it before I had left. There hadn't been any phone calls that night. I'm not exactly sure what compelled me to push play on that recorder, especially when, for all I knew, Renee and Allison were both asleep and could be rudely awakened. My finger seemed to hover over that button for a mere second before I pushed it in, rather aggressively. What I heard on that recording has never, ever left me. The timestamp of the message was 10:14. We had left the house at 5 after 10. "Hey, sweetie, it's Renee. There is some kind of holdup on the highway here. Maybe an accident or road work. I'll probably be about half an hour later than expected. I'm so sorry. Help yourself to some dessert while you wait. Hope Allison didn't give you too much grief tonight." Her voice sounded cheery, normal, real. I looked at Mark. My heart sunk. My eyes flooded with tears. "Allison," I managed to sputter. Mark disappeared up the staircase to Allison's room, taking steps 3 at a time. After a painfully long minute, he sauntered down the stairs, much slower than he had ascended them. "She's fine, sleeping soundly," Mark said, without emotion. Mark and I found our way to the living room, where we sat without eye contact or conversation until Renee pulled up the driveway. She seemed exhausted, glad to be home and off the congested road. She chattered on about her evening, then wrote me a check with a generous tip, thanked me for my patience, and smiled, the kind of smile that seemed absolutely genuine, that slowly faded when socially appropriate. We stumbled down to our car in a daze, passing Renee's Suburban, which still gleamed from a recent trip to the car wash. I never had the heart to tell Renee what had happened that evening. I also never found the first check from the grinning woman. I ended up canceling my next 2 shifts, feigning sickness. I finally emailed Renee, telling her that my program was getting especially intense and that I didn't think it best to continue sitting for them. She bought the story, and now I'm free. Free from the darkness that enveloped the home in the mountains, where I once met a woman who wouldn't stop smiling.
For most of my life, I had lived in the same apartment. It was on the 3rd floor and overlooked the busy city. It was also directly next to another apartment, which means you could hear everything going on behind the right-hand side bedroom wall. I would occasionally hear faint noises coming from behind the wall. There would be scraping, which I assumed was the sound of a chair being pulled along the floor. Sometimes voices could be heard. I guessed they were either from the residents living there or from a TV or radio. And then there was the banging. The banging was a rare occurrence, but whenever it happened, it really annoyed me. Why wouldn't it? It always seemed to happen when I was trying to sleep, and considering my bed was right against the wall where it was the loudest, I was usually awoken by it. It was loud and frantic usually, like someone trying to get attention. I always thought it was a young child doing its best to upset its parents, but I was never sure. Mostly because I had never met the residents of the apartment. I would rarely go out and never spoke to or saw the residents of the apartment next to mine, but God, could I hear them. Like I said earlier, this banging was a rare occurrence, which meant at most times I would get a good night's sleep. But whenever I didn't, it was always because of that banging. However, I remained in the apartment. It's not as if it happened all the time, and it wasn't a major thing. Definitely not a reason to move out. There's a different reason I moved out. It was the tapping. I remember the first and only time it happened. It was late and I was trying to sleep. As I slowly drifted off, I heard the faintest of tapping coming from the other side of the wall. I simply shrugged it off and quickly forgot about it. Once again, as I was close to falling into slumber, there was more tapping. It was slightly louder than the first time and prompted me to open my eyes. For a moment, I just laid there, waiting for it to happen again, and it did. It had gotten even louder. I sighed as I realized it was going to be another night with hardly any rest. Despite this knowledge, I still tried to get some sleep. Unfortunately, the tapping continued. There was always about 3 to 4 minutes after one succession of taps before another round occurred. It was like whoever was tapping was waiting for a reply from me. Like they knew I was there, listening to them, ignoring them. This freaked me out slightly, but I brushed it off as best I could. After a couple more rounds of tapping, I finally snapped. It was 2 in the morning and it was obvious I wasn't getting any sleep until whoever was tapping got a response from me. So I gave in and participated in the childish game. I tapped lightly on the wall. There was silence, then knocking from the other side. I replied and then waited. A moment later, whoever was on the other side knocked back. It was louder than before, much louder. Almost like they were slamming their fist against the wall. I hesitated at first, but then cautiously tapped against the wall again. This time the person on the other side of the wall took longer to reply, so long that I thought they had stopped. So I tried to get back to sleep. But I was quickly startled from my slumber by an extremely loud, frantic banging against the wall. I shot up into a sitting position, my mouth slightly agape, my eyes wide. The banging was so loud and frenzied I thought the person on the other side was trying to break through my wall. I sat there, frozen, just staring at my bedroom wall. It continued non-stop for a couple of minutes and was beginning to give me a headache. I could just make out the sound of scraping behind the banging. Then it stopped. Everything went quiet. I sat there for a while. At that moment, I wouldn't have even minded some banging. I just wanted to hear something that would tell me everything was all right. But there was nothing. Nothing but eerie silence. Placing my ear against the wall, I listened closely for something, anything. But there was nothing. It took a while for me to get to sleep that night. I woke up the next day tired and still thinking about the night before. After a couple of days, I managed to brush it off as best I could. But the sense of normality and of being carefree didn't last long. It was some time after the tapping incident that I heard a knock at my front door. It was the police. They said they had come to question me about a murder that had happened next door. Apparently, at around 2 a.m. a couple of weeks ago, the father of a 10-year-old boy killed his son with an axe. The police say he was killed with one blow. They also said the father was nowhere to be found, but the son's body was still in his room. I was unnerved when I heard about the murder. The police said the boy had been killed a couple of weeks ago in his room. It all happened on the night of the tapping incident inside the boy's room, which was right next to mine. I'd never seen my neighbors, but God knows I've heard them.
My Last Camping Trip, written by Dustin Koski. Narration, music, and audio production by Jeff Clement. One day in September of 1983, we decided to go on a patrol camping trip so that we'd get some prizes at the end of the year. Our scout troop owned a campsite on top of a big rocky hill. It was just our rotten luck that when we agreed to meet to start the campout, there had been a steady rain going on all day that didn't look like it was going to stop for hours. But our parents were all either going away for the weekend or thought rain was no reason to cancel the camping trip. Anyway, it was just barely going to be warm enough for this to be our last chance to have a patrol campout that year. There were 4 of us trudging up one of the thin paths on the hill with our limited gear under dismal green ponchos. Me, Eric, Tony, and Sam, in that order. We were miserable and irritable except for Tony. We had reached a point where we enjoyed hurting Tony. Tony was one of those kids that get put into Boy Scouts of America only because they have a parent that wants free babysitting. I imagine most of the time his mom mostly talked to him by yelling at him, and the only way he knew how to relate to the rest of us was to annoy us. He was also the youngest guy in my patrol, and the shortest, so it was fairly easy for us to bully him, especially when we thought he was doing his best to bring it on himself. I think Tony was delighted that the rest of the patrol was already on edge, so it would be easier for him to get a rise out of us. At that moment, he had decided to focus on Eric. Eric was a real goody-goody most of the time. He was a pretty good athlete and an A student. I'm pretty sure that at 15 he'd never had sex, a puff of anything, or any booze. But he loved beating on Tony as much as the rest of us did. That seemed to be his only vice. And frankly, it kept the guy from creeping me out by being too perfect. He'd certainly looked ready to give someone a beating when I glanced back at him during that little hike.
Hey, Eric,
Tony said. I glanced over my shoulder. Tony had run up next to Eric like a puppy dog, because he knew otherwise Eric would ignore him. There was barely any room on the path for him to do that if he turned himself sideways.
What?
Eric said.
I can read your mind.
Sometimes Tony would be weird or still like a little kid when he pestered us.
Okay,
Eric said. I looked forward again.
Think of a number. I can guess it.
Tony was pitching his voice up.
Okay,
Eric said.
It's 30,
Tony told him.
No. You're just saying that. Really, I was right. Wasn't I?
Huh? Wasn't I? From the sound of Poncho's rustling, I assumed that Tony began to push against Eric. He would do that for minutes on end if you'd let him. Sometimes he might even start humping your leg if you were another scout. Get away from me, Eric said. I didn't see it, but it was obvious before I even turned around what had happened. Eric thoughtlessly pushed Tony away, just wanting the little creep off him. As narrow and slippery as the trail was, he had pushed Tony off it. Tony screamed as he went down the very steep portion of hill, almost catching several trees before having his legs tripped out from under him by a stump. The stump was unfortunately only a little uphill from a large sandstone rock. Tony went into it head first with the sound of a loud crack. I stared at him for half a minute or so then, and he didn't so much as twitch from what I could see. "Oh my God," Sam said after a long silence, which seemed to snap the rest of us out of it. "Let's go help him." "Yeah," I said. Back then, this meant running down there to carry him to the nearest house out of the park since cell phones for kids were still decades off. I tried to start down the hill, but Eric was still standing in the way. He turned to me. "We've got to tell people what happened, right?" Sam stopped and looked over at us. Eric looked down at him. "We need to tell everyone that he slipped and fell. Got it?" "We've got to help Tony," Sam shouted. "And we will," Eric said. "But first, we need to be clear that we're going to tell everyone that he fell, right? You got me? That's what we tell everyone." "I don't know," I said. "I didn't see it happen." Eric looked at me and nodded. That seemed good enough for him. Then he looked back at Sam. "You pushed him. We have to help him," Sam said in bewilderment. Sam had never been the cleverest guy in the patrol, but I would have thought he'd have the sense to play along under the circumstances. "We will," Eric responded. "But first, I need you to say that you'll tell everyone that he slipped and he fell." I nodded desperately at Sam, gesturing for him to tell Eric what he needed to hear so we could get down there and try to help Tony. "No," Sam said. Eric stared at him. "All right," Eric said. "Let's go." We walked quickly, not about to run for fear of slipping and falling like Tony just had. "It wouldn't have done you much good anyway," Sam said after a little while, apparently trying to help Eric feel better. "Tony still would have told everyone you tried to kill him no matter what." "Yeah, but that's Tony. Who'd have cared if the rest of us had our story straight?" Eric said, his voice flat. He seemed to speed up from behind Sam. "Which way do you think would be the fastest to—" "Hey!" Eric grabbed Sam. Sam yelled as Eric dragged him to the edge of the path. "Say it!" Eric shrieked. "Say that you'll tell everyone that he slipped!" Eric sounded more scared than he did intimidating as he held Sam at the edge of the path, seemingly ready to let him fall. "Fuck you!" Sam yelled, and he began to flail. He hurt Eric more than I would have expected, judging by how Eric grunted. Maybe it was pure adrenaline, but Sam got free somehow and began pushing him to the other side of the trail, right into a cliff. "Jesus Christ, stop fighting!" I yelled at them. I might as well have been speaking Chinese. I took a few steps closer and saw there was murder in both their eyes, so I stepped back. Sam got his hand on Eric's chin and pushed his head into the rocks behind him as hard as he could. Eric was really trembling then, like an old man with Parkinson's. It was as if he was experiencing a panic attack in the middle of a fight. Even so, he wasn't going to just take Sam's beating. He grabbed Sam again and kind of picked him up like Sam was a tackling dummy and then charged forward blindly, Sam's poncho over his face. He misjudged the distance to the edge of the path and both Sam and he went rolling down the hill. They struck trees with sickening noises as they fell to a level area. They were much more fortunate than Tony. I could see their movements and hear them screaming when they stopped falling down the hill, but neither of them even tried to get up. I walked as quickly and safely as I could down the trail and then looped back around to where Sam and Eric were. Both were yelling for my help at first, but as I proceeded down the trail, Eric abruptly went quiet. "My leg's broken," Sam told me as soon as he saw me arrive where they'd fallen. The bone's sticking out! It was true. His poncho had folded up and I saw the bulge in his lower left pant leg beneath the knee. Blood had soaked through his pants with the rainwater. "Hey," Eric said flatly. His lack of emotion made me look over to him as Sam screamed at both of us. "I think I hurt my spine. I can't move my legs. I can't feel them." From what I could see of how his body was twisted, that might well have been possible. I didn't know then how Eric could be so emotionless about it, but in hindsight, of course he was in shock, if not in psychological denial. "All right, guys. I'll do what I can for Tony, and then I'll get help for everyone," I said. Sam screamed at me that that was the wrong thing to do, that I should leave the park and get help immediately. For all my first aid training, I didn't know if either of us were right. I thought maybe there was something I could do with the first aid kit for Tony, whose injury had seemed the most severe. Maybe Tony had vomited and I had to clear his breathing passage. I had to check on him. I tried to reassure them before leaving. Sam swore at my back as I ran over to Tony, while Eric remained quiet. I ran to where I had seen Tony's head hit the rock. I had walked by it on hikes and camping trips numerous times and knew the rocks and trees. I'd seen the rock that Tony had hit his head on numerous times and knew when I'd reached it. When I did, I froze for what felt like minutes. Tony was gone. There was no sign he'd been there except some blood had pooled by the rock where he'd struck his head. It was still wet and red on the sandstone. I looked around and called for him. I ran a short distance each way around the rock. I couldn't see a sign of him. Not a footprint in mud, not a drop of blood, anything. I noticed something else as I searched. Sounds seemed to be fading away. I could hardly hear the rain around me. I couldn't even hear my footsteps in the shallow puddles on the ground. I couldn't even hear Sam, although I had seconds before. My own voice seemed muffled to my ears. I had been afraid before, but I'd never known the sound to fade away like that. I began to feel something. Not the feeling you get when you're being watched, but the one you get when someone you fear is standing right over you. I turned, and there was no one there, of course. The feeling didn't let up. It seemed to grow stronger and stronger. There was nothing to hear, not even my own breathing or the beat of my heart. I ran back to where I'd left the other two scouts as fast as I'd ever run towards anything. Slowly, I could hear again that Sam was still screaming in pain and cursing out Eric. Eric barely moved his head to look at me when I arrived. Sam went quiet after I told them of Tony's disappearance. "How?" was all Sam could think to say. I felt that sensation again of a presence all around me again. It was faint, but noticeable. "I don't know. Sam, how are your arms? Can I carry you out of here, packstrap style?" I had 2 years and 18 inches of height on Sam, so I knew I could carry him out. Sam said I would. Whatever presence I was feeling, he seemed aware of it too, through his pain, and he didn't need to be sold on being taken out of the park, painful as it surely would be. I got out my first aid kit quickly, left my pack on the ground, and hastily made him a splint. He screamed as I lifted him up onto my back. "Wait! What about me?" Eric asked, some emotion back in his voice. I glanced over at him. His eyes were wide, and his skin was becoming pale. "I can only carry one person. We'll get you help as fast as we can. But what if whatever made Tony disappear?" Looking back on Eric, I find it hard to fault him now. He was just a kid. He'd made a mistake, meaning only a little, if any, harm. The smaller amount of harm that we'd all inflicted on Tony time and again. Then he'd seen all his life, all his accomplishments, his future, all about to be tarnished because of what he'd accidentally done to someone we all mostly thought of as dirt. He overreacted like probably many of us would back when we had little life experience and perspective of a guy in his lower teens. But at the time, I just glared at him for a second as he lay twisted and helpless on the ground, reaching up to me. "Maybe you deserve it," I told him. I turned my back on him and began carrying Sam out of the park. "Hey, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt Tony. I wasn't going to drop Sam. I was bluffing. I'm sorry. I'll do anything you want if you can get me out of here. I'll give you everything, please. Don't leave me alone." "What was that? There's something out here. Come back. Please. I swear I'll do anything. Please. Please. Come back." His voice faded quickly, and the sound of rain and Sam's pain resumed. As I walked, the feeling of that presence faded as well. I had almost a mile to go in the rain before there would be a house with a phone, and Sam was moaning and wincing practically with every step. I made slow, frustrating progress for a few hundred yards before I slipped and landed heavily on my left knee. Sam screeched in my ear after his upper chest hit my shoulder. "I think I broke a rib back there. You can't carry me like this." I didn't know he could have broken a rib and only started to feel it now, but I wasn't about to argue. As carefully as I could in my anxiety, I placed him on the ground in a sitting position and switched the carrying style to firefighter carrying style so that he was mostly over my shoulder. "Is that better?" I asked him when I'd hoisted him back up. He had winced again as I held him up. "It still hurts, but it's better." We rounded a curve on the trail and were approaching a fairly gentle slope where the parking lot was situated. I thought of it then as the end of the park. Sam had begun to feel easier to carry, so I felt then I'd be able to make it out of this forest. I remember that since I'd been in the park many times before, and even with another scout on my back being carried like this who was constantly voicing his pain, things were coming back to normal. Whatever feeling I'd experienced over where I thought Tony had disappeared was going away. Things began to feel so normal that the idea Tony had just gotten up and walked away and emergency services would soon find him was believable. I guess what I felt then was that all I had to do was carry Sam, and then it would be up to the adults to take care of all of this. "Oh, Jesus," Sam suddenly said quietly. "Run! Run! Run! Fucking run!" Before I could ask or turn to see what I was to run from, he struck me as hard as he could on the side. He did this again and again, even after I started running. It was difficult to run even a few steps with such a heavy, awkward weight. It became easier when I noticed something that was already too familiar. Sam's voice became quieter, even as he thrashed and screeched more shrilly on my back. He might have said what it was or described anything about it, but within seconds he was as muted as my silent steps in the puddles on the pathway. I reached the bottom of the incline. Sam was convulsing then, which I felt was a sign that whatever I was trying to flee was getting closer. He was still hitting me in the side, but it was weaker and more erratically. The path up the hill was full of loose rocks and gravel. In weather like this, it was impossible to keep a solid foothold, but by some miracle I was able to run up it and maintain a hold on him, even as he practically seemed to be trying to break free, and I was trembling. I remember thinking I faintly heard something then, something like a splash. That had to be a good sign. Halfway up the hill, I felt a horrible sensation in my feet. They were going numb. I remember not understanding why, and even with all the momentum I had built up, my feet landed awkwardly, like I'd slipped on ice but still landed on my feet. I barely had time to feel pain in my ankles because they went numb as well. I was barely able to stumble forward before the numbness climbed up to my knees. My legs were useless then. I fell forward, practically face first. Sam got free, even with his fractures, flipped over and crawled up the hill. I tried myself. I could feel the numbness had reached my ribcage then, but dragged myself across the rocks. I remember perfectly the sight of Sam dragging himself too while twitching and trembling as he crawled. A force hit the back of my head that felt like a construction beam dropped from a crane. My face went into the ground, rocks stabbing into my cheeks hard enough to break the skin as I seemed to lose all fight and flight instinct. I just lay there like a breathing corpse. Even if I hadn't been numb, I didn't have any energy, any hope, any understanding of what was happening to me. I didn't even have the courage to lift my hood up to see what was happening around me. I don't know how long I lay there. The numbness left me, but I still didn't lift my hood. So little light was coming in under my hood that night might have fallen and I wouldn't have been able to tell. A long time later, the rain stopped. A longer time after that, I began to hear again. I heard birds tweeting, cars driving by from what sounded like miles away. I didn't move. After a long time of only hearing these sounds of nature, I heard footsteps approaching me. They stopped suddenly, and then clearly changed to those of someone running up to me.
Are you all right?
An old man, whose name I don't remember, said as he leaned over and pulled my hood back. I looked up at him, rocks still stabbed into my face. He winced as he saw it.
Christ, kid. What happened to you?
I don't know, I said. I still don't know. I don't want to. I know that Eric, Tony, and Sam were never found, nor was any trace of anything that might have made them disappear. I learned even that reluctantly. Look for answers. Hell, I don't even go near forests any longer. Staying away from forests isn't enough. I've developed a need for sound. Always. After a minute without hearing something, I feel anxious. Sleeping without it is impossible. If whatever got my fellow scouts comes for me, I want as much warning as I can get. That brings me to the reason I'm sharing this. Lately, even with music at full volume and me screaming my lungs out, I've been experiencing minutes of silence. At home, at work, out driving. When I've gone on visits, I've been experiencing it. It's been many years since the end of my last camping trip, but it seems like I'm about to feel that presence again. When it wants, I believe it will make me experience a silence that will never end.
Daycare. Written by L. Chan. Narrated by Kellie Fitzgerald. I still can't get what happened last week out of my head. I mean, it doesn't fit together at all. I haven't been able to get any rest for the past few days just thinking about it, so I just figured I'd write it down here and see if you guys had any better luck explaining it. I work in Daycare. It's a pretty established place in a big city on the coast. That's about all I can say. I still work there, and I don't want someone linking this post back to my employer. I'm not supposed to talk about anything that happens to the kids online. We mostly cater to the professional crowd, busy people in finance and internet startups who don't use the office daycare, or don't have any office daycare. It's a common sight to see someone in a business suit drop off a baby with a large cup of Starbucks in the other hand. People who can afford to blow $25 a week on coffee. Go figure. One of the attractions was that we offered daycare for infants as well. A godsend for the jet-setting crowd in the city, I suppose. Lucy C. was my favorite baby. Lucy's her real first name, which is all I'm prepared to share. We all have favorites working in daycare. We're not like parents, having to spread the love out equally. Anyway, when you're faced with 4 screaming babies, you grow to like the quiet ones more than the others. Lucy C. was as close to a perfect baby as we'd ever cared for. Wasn't much of a crier, unless her nappy was full. Went to sleep like clockwork. She had a crown of wispy blonde hair, which set off her piercing cornflower blue eyes. Mr. C, as far as I could gather, was a self-made businessman. One of those internet startup companies. I never caught what he did, and the 5-minute handovers in the morning really didn't make for startling revelations about his hopes and dreams. He was always dressed sharply. I'm not one for chasing fashion, but some of the other girls here whispered designer labels that I'd only heard of in celebrity mags when they referred to his latest threads. He seemed genuinely pleasant, if a little distracted in the mornings. I've never seen a Mrs. C. There was an Abigail C. on the emergency contact form that all the parents had to leave with the center, but she was listed as his sister. I know some of the others joked about whether he was on the market, so to speak, when they saw his sports car pull up to drop off little Lucy in the mornings. But that was just our equivalent of locker room talk. He was awfully rich, though. Successful in an ecosystem which chewed up and spit out 100 other young businessmen every year. Some kind of magic touch, the others said. Coming out of nowhere and building something up like that. Young Entrepreneur of the Year award and all that jazz. I try to think back to that morning last week. Did Mr. C look strange that morning when he dropped Lucy off? To be honest, I've been over those 5 minutes hundreds of times over the past few days. His suit was immaculate. He greeted me like he did with the rest of the staff. Warm smile, a kiss for Lucy, a gentle request for us to take good care of his girl. Just about the same thing any of the other 20 or so parents that hour would have said. Maybe there really wasn't anything wrong. I kept on thinking back because if things had gone differently, I might have been able to save Lucy. Shit, I don't know why I wrote that. Lucy's fine, or she should be. I don't know why I can't get it out of my head that I made a terrible mistake. Why there's this guilt I feel when I check in at work and look at her favorite toys on the playroom floor. The children were taking their afternoon naps after the midday meal. The chime told me that someone was at the desk. The other staff were busy with cleanup, so I went to see who it was. We didn't have any early pickup scheduled, so I thought it might be someone making inquiries. The guy was dressed in a suit, same as most of the other parents. It was a rich part of town. My breath caught a little when I saw him. He was really good-looking. Not your high school crush good-looking. I mean, that guy looked like he was plucked straight from a fashion magazine. He stepped up to the counter, flashed this perfect white smile at me. There was something about this guy. I mean, that smile made me go a little weak at the knees, and it's embarrassing to say, but it also gave me a bit of a tingle down in my pants, if you know what I mean. And then the strange part. As soon as I felt that little spark of arousal, it got drowned in this terrible feeling. Dirty, shameful. Like that time I'd walked in to call my younger brother down for dinner and found him jacking it off to some random porn site. The kind of dirty that makes you feel like you'll never be able to scrub it off. When the man spoke, he had a sort of radio voice, kind of deep and smooth. It fit him perfectly.
Mr. C and I had an agreement. I'm here to collect Lucy,
he said. Not that Mr. C sent him. Not introducing himself. It was such a strange thing to say that I just stood there and gaped for a minute. He just stood there, his eyes twinkling with good humor from the devilishly handsome face, like he already knew the punchline to the joke. It was an odd request, but we do get third-party pickups from time to time. It's very, very rare. And we either need to be told in advance or be informed personally by the parents. Nobody had mentioned that baby Lucy was going to be picked up that day. I told the man that we couldn't do it unless he had authorization from the parent. He appeared to wait a while, deep in thought. Then he smiled and told me that everything had been arranged. He gestured toward the phone on the table. Just then, the damn thing rang. I jumped, a little edgier than I should have been. This strange man was really making me nervous. He had this weird air about him. It was intimidating. Like I was totally undeserving of his attention. His stare made my breath catch in my throat. On the phone, Mr. C. That was odd. He didn't have my number. Hell, I didn't have his number stored on my personal phone either. And it was on FaceTime as well. I accepted the call and Mr. C's face filled the screen. Something was off about that call. At first I figured it had to be the network connected. A little lag. His lips were out of sync with his voice. It was a disconcerting image, like a badly dubbed film.
Hey, there's a guy over there with you, right?
Mr. C had a look of intense concentration on his face. There was something else there, a mark on his cheek. It was too small, too blurry on the screen of my phone to make out. I knew for sure that it had not been there when he left Lucy in the morning. It seemed like some angular shape, the size of a quarter. Yes, there is, sir. I was mesmerized by the video feed.
You need to give Lucy to him. You hear? Just give him Lucy.
His tone was clipped, urgent. There was something else about those flapping lips. They seemed to be repeating the same thing over and over. If you say so, Mr. C, is there something wrong? Same two words. I could almost make them out.
Nothing's wrong. Just give him the girl. I'll be fine after that.
I could see the slight parting of his lips for the sibilant, a small roll of his tongue for the second word, and repeated over and over. I looked back up at the man, standing there with a quiet smirk on his face. I'll go get the baby. I left him there, and slowly made my way to the creches. SL. I turned the words over in my head. What could Mr. C have been trying to say? SL. Save. Save? Lucy? I stood over the crib where she lay sleeping. She gave a gurgle of complaint as I scooped her up into my arms. Save Lucy, Mr. C had said. Did he know about the man at the counter? What agreement did they have? My mind was clouded with questions. I'd been given a direct instruction from the parent. Maybe there was a home emergency or something else. The man beamed widely. He drew closer to the counter. There was a smoky smell about him. I hadn't figured him for a smoker, with his perfect white teeth and his toned physique. He reached out for Lucy. I stopped short. How do I even know you're the man that Mr. C told me about? You could be anyone, I said defiantly, not intending to let her go without a fight.
Oh, Mr. C and I go back a long way. You could call me a godparent almost.
His mouth twisted at the penultimate word, like it left a sour taste in his mouth.
I've been watching over her since she was a baby. Here, I'll prove it. She has a small birthmark on her left hip. Check and see.
Triumph. There was no such birthmark on her. I'd gone over the files of each of my charges, and I knew them almost as well as their parents did, maybe even better. After all, I spent more time with them. I placed Lucy on the table and tugged at her nappy, expecting to see pale skin. My mouth dropped open when I saw that angry red mark on her hip. That was not all. It was familiar. It was the same mark that had been on Mr. C's cheek. Try to remember what the mark looked like, but every time I do, my mind slides of the shape. It's slippery in my mind, like trying to grasp a fish. It was small and angular, almost like one of those runes they have in fantasy novels. That's the worst thing. I stared at it for a good 5 minutes, and I can't form the shape in my head when I try to remember it.
You seem reluctant, young lady. I assure you that no further inconvenience will befall you regarding this matter. The business is between me and baby Lucy here.
He leaned forward over the counter.
It's a slow day. I suppose you and I could come to some small agreement for the handover. The child needs to be given willingly, and I'd hate for this to be delayed any further than it already has.
The smell of smoke grew stronger. I picked up the baby and hugged her to my chest. She began to squall at the uncomfortable pressure. "I'll need to speak to my supervisor about this," I said. The man sighed and straightened up.
I was really hoping to be done with this business this afternoon. No matter. What's due to me will come in the end. If not from you, then maybe from someone else more amenable.
I turned around to call for the manager, but when she called back and I turned to the counter, the man was already gone, without so much as a chime from the door. I shook my head. He had been there a moment before, and there hadn't been a single noise when he disappeared. He left nothing but the faint smell of smoke and a freezing cold spot on the counter where he'd rested his elbows. I censored the worst part of the events of the afternoon, saying that someone had come by to pick Lucy up and left without her. The manager, Jane, didn't believe me. She looked Mr. C up on the register and gave him a call from the counter phone. I watched, biting my lip, as her jaw dropped and her face turned white. "You must have been mistaken," she swallowed. She took a shuddering breath. "That was the cops. Mr. C is dead." After dropping Lucy off this morning, he drove straight to his office and blew his brains out. I shivered. Jane mistook my reaction for shock. That it was, but shock of a different kind. I took a look at my call history. 3:35. The call was at 3:35. I shook so hard. The phone clattered to the floor. Jane was still her take-charge self. Even while reeling from shock, she managed to call up the emergency number from the register with shaky fingers and dialed Abigail C., Mr. C's sister. The cops weren't going to pick Lucy up. They had better things to do. She would be on the red-eye flight over to get Lucy first thing in the morning. That left us with the problem of taking care of the baby overnight. Jane offered to pay me double to stay there overnight with Lucy, and I'd get the day off the next day to boot. It was a practical decision. None of the staff had small children at home, and it would be easier to leave the baby in a familiar environment than to move all the stuff to one of our houses. I had settled down for the evening. Dinner was some forgettable microwaved package out of the fridge. At least the place was set up for sleeping over. I'd been given a couple of hours off to grab an overnight bag and a shower. One by one, the rest of the staff said goodbye, until it was just me and Lucy. I couldn't shake off the feeling that there was someone else in the center apart from Lucy and I. The kind of feeling you get on the small hairs on the back of your neck that something isn't quite right. I put it down to that creepy episode with the dark man earlier in the day and that impossible phone call. I checked on Lucy for the 5th or 6th time. She was sound asleep. Sleep came less easy for me. Lucy's crying woke me up in the middle of the night. I rushed over to the next room. I checked her nappy. She didn't need changing. It was only after I blinked the sleep from my eyes that I saw the indentation of a hand on the clean white sheets of her crib. A big print, a man's hand. I didn't have to touch it to know that it would be freezing cold, just like the countertop. But I did it anyway. I sucked at my lips as the cold sheet burnt my finger, almost like putting my finger on an ice cube straight from the freezer. I hugged Lucy to my chest. I gave a little scream as my phone rang from the next room. I looked at the number. Mr. C. It took me 3 tries to hang up, my quivering finger missing the little spot on the touchscreen over and over. Immediately after I killed the call, my phone sounded again, and again, and again, until I powered it down. I glared at it, chest heaving. Ever wondered what goes through your mind when there's nothing pumping through your veins but ice? And no motivation but raw animal fear? Nothing. That's what. Instincts take over. You look for an escape, an opportunity. But what was there to run from? The feeling that I was being watched by that dark stranger. The phone calls from a dead man. I hit all the lights in the center. Power bill be damned. I felt trapped by those cheery pastel walls. I looked at the clock. 3 a.m. Another 3 hours till first light. I held Lucy tighter. Those were the longest 3 hours of my life. A rap on the front door woke me up. A tall, thin woman stood outside the glass doors of the center. She was dressed for mourning, black from head to toe. It was windy out, her short bob whipping around her head. I hurried to let her in. She introduced herself as Mr. C's sister. Sensing my doubt, she showed me her driver's license and the phone, which had the number on our records. Lucy didn't complain when the lady picked her up. I got the release form ready and passed it over for the lady's perfunctory signature. Everything checked out except for one thing. She didn't have a trace of sadness around her, apart from a little dark under her eyes from the late flight across the country. Funny, for someone whose brother had just shot himself. She flashed me a smile as she pushed the signed form back across the glass counter. I watched her stride confidently back out through the glass doors. There was something out of place with Mr. C's sister. From someone else more amenable. That's what the man said. If not me, then someone else. There was a thud as the door closed. The wind snagged the woman's hair from the collar of her dress, and there, red and raw, on the nape of her neck, was the same symbol. By the time I get out from behind the counter and out through the door, they were both gone. It's been a week. Mr. C didn't have family in town. The authorities didn't bother us about her, really. The cop called to make sure that she had been handed over to an appropriate guardian, and that was that. When nobody was looking, I would try dialing both Mr. C's number as well as his sister. The numbers were live for a day or so, and then they were disconnected. I've tried for hours to remember the symbol that was on Lucy's hip, the bizarre thing that appeared the day her father died, but I can't. I just can't do it. I wonder what kind of agreement he had with Mr. C, and how Lucy fit into the whole thing. I hope that Lucy is all right, somewhere out there, and that I'm just being paranoid. I know, deep in my heart, that this is a lie I need to tell myself if I am to have any semblance of normalcy after that one day. Most of all, I try to forget the face of the dark stranger with the perfect smile, who made me feel all hot and shameful at once, and those freezing cold hands. And I lie awake in bed, hoping that if I forget him, then maybe, just maybe, he will not remember me.
Chilling tales for dark nights.